This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of A Girl on the Shore and Goodnight Punpun, Volume 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys who love to talk about manga. And on this month's episode of the manga series, we're going to look at two recent publications from the same creator, Inio Asano. We're going to begin with his book, A Girl on the Shore. And then after that, we're going to take a look at the first volume of Goodnight Punpun. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga series is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some really good specials. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes you'll find them at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
This month you can find books like Silent Mobius for 25% off and Cross Game, which I've heard very, very good things about, for 30% off.
That's right. So, you know, whether you like your comics in manga or in non-manga, it doesn't matter. It's all comics, and you can get them all at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. And you know, Shea, I know of another place to get a great price on something really cool.
Yeah, what's that?
And that is coffee. And if you go to the website of our other sponsor for this episode, which is Just Coffee Co-op, you'll find unbelievable deals on coffee. They have 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified coffee roasted to order. They do everything in small batches, no mass production whatsoever.
Sounds good to me.
And if you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, put all that coffee, tea, and chocolate into your shopping cart. Make sure to use our coupon code COMICS, that's COMICS. That'll give you 10% off of your order. And remember, shipping is always free. So go to justcoffee.coop. It's a great place to get caffeinated. Shea, we should also remind our listeners that we are still doing our demographic survey, and we would like everyone to go to the website survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative. That's survey.libsyn, LIBSYN.com/comicsalternative, and it'll take you only a minute to answer 6 very simple, quick questions. Things like gender, age, marital status, ethnicity, just the basic stuff. Now, you don't have to include your email address in that survey, but if you do, you will be entered in a drawing for a free and official Comics Alternative t-shirt. When we get them printed up later this year, the winner from this drawing will get a Comics Alternative t-shirt. So go to survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative. In fact, you can do that as you're listening to this podcast episode, unless you're driving, of course. So, Shea, you want to get into some Inio Asano talk?
Yes, I would love to get into some Inio Asano talk.
Now, this is a creator that both you and I really enjoy, and we've been waiting for these two books for several months now.
Yeah, he is we've talked about him a little bit off air, but I know for me he is one of the best. I think one of the best, most interesting working cartoonists today.
He is, and I think he's got both in many ways, I guess he's all over the map because there's a very serious side of him, dark at times. On the other hand, there are parts of his narratives that are rather tender. A lot of his writing, and some of which we're going to be talking about today, is quite explicit, let's say, sexual in nature. But there's also a comedic side of him, and also a side of him that's a little whacked out.
That's true. We talked a little about those things before we started recording, but I think in the books we're going to talk about today, he demonstrates a pretty substantive range, but there's some kind of through lines that run through all his work.
Yeah, and I think both you and I were introduced to his work in Nijigahara Holograph, which came out a few years ago from Fantagraphics. And I think of all the stuff that I've read of his, this is probably the most mature. It's the most developed.
Nijigahara Holograph is,
yes.
You think? I think... Yeah, I don't know. I'd probably have to think about it a little more, but I'd probably agree with that. I think that was. I'm looking now, but I think that was. Oh no, that was before A Girl on the Shore. I thought that was one of his later works because his works are being published all out of sequential order. But
yeah, I think it was originally published in Japanese in 2006, and then Fantagraphics came out with their edition in 2014.
Yeah, that looks about right.
And one of the reasons why I call this his most developed or most mature work is it may be because it's just so damn ambiguous, the way that it's written, in that it's not the easiest story to follow. Now, I think some of that could apply to what we're about to talk about with A Girl on the Shore, but I think with Nijigahara Holograph, this is even much more so the case, where you have almost an impressionistic method of storytelling that you don't get in some of his other work. I think one of his earlier books, which I really enjoy as well, is Solanin. And this is, he wrote it when he was really young, and it has that young feel to it. It's a story about a young girl, her relationship with a boyfriend, and what that means to her as things develop. And then there's certain things that happen I won't mention because they could be spoiler territory, that causes her life to go in a particular direction. So, but that's a different kind of book than Nijigahara Holograph. But I think if you want to get another sense or another side of Asano's work, you could look at what's published, at least in English, through Viz Media in 2 volumes, What a Wonderful World. Those were a collection of stories, short works, but they're all interconnected in a variety of different ways. In such a way that I would call them, I guess, the comics equivalent to a short story cycle, which I have called in a few places a graphic cycle. And that's really inventive. So, when I mentioned toward the top of the show that he has done a variety of different things with different tones and different subject matter, kind of like all over the map. And I think these are some good examples because Solanin is very different from Nijigahara Holograph, which is very different from What a Wonderful World, which is different from the 2 books that we're going to be discussing today.
Yeah, I definitely agree that he's kind of all over the map, but I actually hadn't read What a Wonderful World. But I'm looking at the description now, and it definitely seems like a book I need to check out.
Oh yeah, those are great stories, really are.
Yeah. So you wanted to talk about A Girl on the Shore first.
Let's talk about A Girl on the Shore first. Now, this came out in January from Vertical Press, and this is not part of a series. It is a self-contained, done-in-one book, or at least we're reading it as one. I mean, this originally came in installments, but this is not part of a longer, ongoing series, unlike Goodnight Punpun. Yeah. So how would you describe A Girl on the Shore?
I think between the two that we're going to talk about today, this is definitely the easier one to describe. It's a pretty straightforward story about Kome and a young girl and a young boy named Isobe, who are, I think, in the 8th grade, like 14 or 15 when the story starts. And then they're like 15 or 16 or so kind of by the time the story ends. And it's just about their budding relationship. I think both of them are emotionally stunted. They don't know how to express themselves in a healthy way, and that leads to a lot of kind of emotional conflict and stuff like that. But it's a pretty straightforward story about this kind of developing relationship between two teenagers.
It is. A couple of things I wanted to add to your description, which I think was really good, a great way into A Girl on the Shore. You mentioned that this is about Kome and Isobe's relationship and the twists and turns that it takes. Much of the book is based on their literal exchange. In other words, the conversations that they have, the physical interactions that they have with one another, in such a way that if you pull back, I didn't feel this so much reading the book, but after I was finished with it, I kind of pulled back and looked at it, figuratively speaking, and I thought, not a whole lot happened in this story. I don't know if decompressed is the right word for this. I'd say leisurely. In other words, we get to see the facets or the grains of their relationship as it develops over time. And there's a lot of story in the development of that relationship. But when you think about it and see this book as primarily about this relationship over a relatively contained period of time, about a year or two, there's really not a lot of story content outside of the relationship in this. But it's still a book that has a lot going on. And the other thing I wanted to mention, again, about the relationship is this is not just a book about let's say a romantic relationship or an emotional relationship. There's a lot of sex here. In fact, things can get quite explicit in this book.
There are. It is definitely a book that
for the faint, not for the faint at heart.
Yeah, I think the Freudian kind of eros and thanatos are the kind of core themes of the book. It really is a book about sex and death. And I think Asano does a good job of taking these teenage characters and exploring how that those kind of libidinal urges don't always satisfy the suicidal tendencies or a character's death wish. You have to deal with those urges kind of head on, and instead of trying to substitute one for the other. But that's definitely at the core of it is this fascination with suicide and with sex.
Right. Now the suicide part of that equation comes primarily from Isobe. He's someone who we learn as we get into the book, and not too far, so this is not a spoiler, that his brother has died. In fact, his brother had apparently committed suicide. And so Isobe himself has, I don't know if you would call it a death wish, but he talks about death, and he talks about offing himself. Not that we would necessarily believe him, but he brings it up every now and again. But Kome is not that way. I mean, she is, well, I don't think she's suicidal, but there is a side of her that has this almost death sense to it. There's kind of an emptiness to her, especially in the first 2/3 of the book. she doesn't seem able to map herself in any particular direction. On the one hand, she's drawn to Isobe, but at the same time, she can't commit herself to him, and not necessarily commit in a boyfriend-girlfriend manner. But she wants the sex, but the emotion doesn't seem to be there, at least at first. And so there is something a little, I guess, empty. I come back to that word, to her at first.
Yeah, there's definitely, and you can particularly see it in Asano spends a lot of time during certain chapters of the book just kind of focusing in on these text message conversations between the characters. And you can see the way he draws her face in certain dramatic scenes, or just kind of the tone and nature of those text messages. She has this disaffected air about her. And I think you're right. She does have this emptiness, it's not a death wish per se, but it is this kind of this denial of life, this unwillingness or inability to kind of be in the moment, to deal with the here and now in a material sense, as if she's just she's not interested so much in dying the way Isobe talks about very frequently, but she doesn't seem all that interested in life per se.
Yeah, and when it comes to their relationship and the tendencies toward, if not death, then kind of an almost apathy. I think one way I looked at A Girl on the Shore is in some ways a combination of Ninjigahara Holograph and Solanine. Solanine, it is I think, straight-out relationship narrative, whereas Ninjigahara Holograph, it's about relationships, but you have some of these same darker themes in it as you'll find in A Girl on the Shore. So, for instance, we were talking earlier about Isobe as being somewhat suicidal. Remember, one of the main characters in Ninjigahara Holograph is, I think his name is Amahiko, and he is very much like Isobe. There's a part of him that does want to die, and he even attempts suicide. Although I don't know if I'd call it suicide in the case of that narrative. It's almost as if he is doing something, but he doesn't know what the ultimate result will be. But again, it seems like A Girl on the Shore is kind of a combination of those two earlier narratives. Kind of a cross-fertilization.
Yeah, I definitely need to read Solanin because it's a book that I obviously haven't read, but it's also a book that the people I know at least talk about as being very different from the rest of his work. So I definitely need to check that out. But I think you're right. Asano isn't. I wouldn't say A Girl on the Shore is about. It's not about. I mean, it both is and isn't about sex. It's because that sexual component is definitely a huge part of the kind of plot of the book and the actual events that Asano depicts. But it's not it's not about that kind of physical interaction the way that it would be in say like a Hiroaki Samura book. Like Die Vergelder that we talked about earlier. That kind of fetishization of the body and that kind of obsession, not with this kind of spiritual signification of that act or what those characters' obsession with the act means for what the story is saying, but an obsession with the physicality of it itself. So Asano does he does interesting things with his inclusion of sex, but I definitely need to read Solanin to kind of get a better idea, like you, because it seems like you've seen some more examples from him about how he handles those kinds of relationships.
Yeah, and you were mentioning the sex or the sexuality in A Girl on the Shore. There is a lot in this book, but I wouldn't call this gratuitous. In other words, I don't think that Asano includes the sex scenes, the panels that are sometimes extremely explicit for purposes of titillation. They definitely do serve a purpose. I mentioned earlier that much of this book is about the progress of the relationship between Komei and Asobe. And I mean, that's mostly what it is. And so there are these long stretches where not only do you have them interacting in conversation, but also very long stretches where they're just exploring one another's bodies and having sex in a variety of different ways. And so you get to see these acts, and sometimes you get to see the sexual act in close-up. So at first you may not know what it is that you're seeing. And at other times, the camera eye, so to speak, kind of pulls back, and you can see that they're in a certain position, or they're, they have one sexual act on one page, and they're doing something else on another. But again, I don't think it's gratuitous. It just strikes me that what they're doing is they're sexually exploring one another and the parameters of their relationship, just as if they would explore the emotional and almost friendly, even problematically friendly sides of their relationship. Another reason why I wouldn't necessarily call this gratuitous is that, and I'm wondering if you notice this as well, there are a variety of instances where Asano did not visually include the detail of anatomy. I am looking at one example of this. This is on page 48. And this is one of the first times that we get to see Asobe. And, well, we don't see his face. We see from the middle of his chest down to, I guess, right above his knees. And he has his pants down. And so we get to see his penis. Unlike the other parts of his body, though, which seem to be drawn in quite a bit of detail, if you see that his penis on page 48, it's almost blank. I mean, there's no detail whatsoever. There's no lines. It's almost as if there's the outline, and that's it. And this is not the only instance where Asano does that. And so, I mean, that's another reason why I think that the sex depicted here is not gratuitous, is not there to titillate. It's almost as if Asano wants to represent the sexual act, but in certain ways, it's as if he's pulling back visually a bit to abstract it more, case in point being the outline of the penis.
I think you hit on a number of things that I think are worth talking about. You mentioned that they would kind of explore each other's bodies in the same way that they would explore the kind of emotional facets of the relationship. And I think that's an interesting point because it's almost as if they're exploring each other physically in that way, and with that kind of obsession because they lack the tools to explore that emotionality of the relationship. They're almost they're engaging in the way they do physically because they're incapable of engaging each other in the way they both need to be engaged emotionally. And I do think it's interesting that you mentioned that it's not gratuitous, and I would definitely agree that it's not gratuitous in the sense that it's definitely part and parcel of the story. It's definitely an important component of what Asano is trying to talk about and the way he's trying to talk about it. But it is certainly more graphic than I was expecting. I wasn't expecting it to be that graphic. But you mentioned Asano's art and the kind of abstraction of his art, and I think you're totally right that he does, play these kind of games with the details of both characters' genitals at point. And my inclination, or my first reading of that was just that it was a manifestation of the kind of censorship that I know affects a lot of manga and anime. Japan has very specific rules about what can be shown and what can't be shown. And I didn't think much of it, but now that you're talking about it, that is an interesting way to work around that. That does kind of play off of and play into other elements of the book. I was going to ask, before you even started talking about that, I was going to ask, this is a perfect segue, what you kind of made of Asano's art, because we've talked a lot about the writing in the book, but he has a very particular and interesting aesthetic that I was wondering how you read. Was that something you enjoyed, that those almost abstract faces with the very, very hyper real backgrounds? Was that something that worked for you?
Oh, yeah, it definitely was. And in fact, in this book, as well as some of the others that I've read of his, including the one we're going to be discussing next, Goodnight Punpun, sometimes his backgrounds are so detailed that they seem photographic. And in fact, there are elements of A Girl on the Shore, and now that I'm looking for it, I can't find the pages, but this is toward the end, that seem to be exactly photographic. I'm trying to remember where I saw them. It's at some point where they are on a train, I think.
No, I know what you're talking about. There are a number of panels where the sky seems like a grayscale photograph. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. There are elements of that pop up throughout the book.
Yeah, but then there are other times that I think that they're photographs, but I look more closely, and they are more obviously illustrations, but highly detailed illustrations. And the way that he draws characters, more times than not, especially with the protagonists, you're going to find a little less detail, and they have, let's say, what we could call, what many people might call, let's say, typical larger manga eyes, right? That moe style. And but he doesn't over-exaggerate it. I mean, I do think that his art is much more photorealistic than most manga that we've discussed on this monthly series.
Yeah, I'm going to try and find an article I read about the way he makes he draws, that maybe you can include in like show notes that that I think is really interesting, because if I'm remembering this article correctly, he actually, almost all of those backgrounds are actually traced photographs. So he has a very unique way of kind of constructing his images that might be of interest. If I can find this, assuming I can find this thing and share it with people, that might be of interest to our listeners.
Yeah. And, another thing I've noticed in Asano's style, if you look at the characters in A Girl on the Shore, but also in Goodnight Punpun, and you read some of his earlier books, there is, it's almost as if there is a character type, both male and female, that he seems to use again and again. I'm not suggesting that he repeats himself in the way that he creates his protagonists, but there seems to be quite a bit of similarity, almost like, as if they're members of the same family among his various narratives.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a fair observation. It's not the Tezuka star system that Osamu Tezuka or even Naoki Urasawa employs, where these two characters are literally drawn the exact same way. But you're right. He definitely has. They all could pass as relatives. They all have very, very similar faces.
Yeah, and last month we were discussing Tetsumi's A Drifting Life, and I know that that's something that defines Tetsumi's style as well, especially with his short stories, in that many of his characters seem to look the same, almost to the point that you wonder if it's the same character among the various stories in his collections.
Do you think that the kind of, not the sameness, but the similarity between his protagonists or his characters, do you think that's to his work's benefit, or do you think it stymies the work?
You mean visually or thematically?
Both.
Well, thematically, no problem at all, because you're going to find that with any creator, comics, prose narrative, what have you, that comes back to certain issues or themes in their work again and again and again. I mean, it defines who they are as a writer. That becomes their style. So that I have no problem with. I mean, I don't have a problem with Asano's visual repetition. I don't know if that's the right word, but the fact that some of his characters seem to look somewhat similar among the various stories, I have no problem with this. I don't think that makes him less of an artist. I think that what that suggests to me is that he has a particular character type, visually speaking, that he privileges or that he tends to come back to, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same, I'm sorry. But then at the same time, I just thought of something. If I look at the 2-volume "What a Wonderful World," where he's telling quite a number of individual stories, he uses the same character in a variety of these stories, but there are many different characters who all look distinctively different. So it's not as if he's repeating. He can only repeat certain visual types over and over again. I mean, he's definitely capable of drawing a variety of different individuals, physical characteristics and whatnot. So, I mean, there may be something intentional behind the way that he illustrates certain characters among his longer narratives.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Do you think that's a limitation?
I don't know. I was just about to say that that's an element of his work that I actually hadn't picked up on. So it's definitely, as I read more of Goodnight Punpun and I try and read more of his work, and hopefully we get more of it in English. That's something I'll have to keep an eye on and think about more, because I hadn't noticed it. So it's something that I don't know if it like I'm with you. I don't think it necessarily is a. I'm not going to think less of his work, less of him as an artist, or of his artistic capacity as a cartoonist. But I mean, thematically, it's just something that I think I need to think about more. I need to really give it some thought.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you. Let's come back to the sex again, because I have a question for you. You mentioned earlier that these guys are, when the story begins, they're in the 8th grade. Then later on, they're in the 9th grade. Now, in the final pages, I think it takes us 2 years or so, or maybe more than 2 years ahead. But throughout most of this book, A Girl on the Shore, I mean, these guys are not even 16 years old yet. Did the fact that not so much that they were having sex, even though that could be disturbing enough, but the fact that things were so explicit. I mean, we're talking, vaginal, we're talking anal, we're talking oral, we're talking a variety of things. I mean, did it bother you that these young people, these kids, were so sexually active in such a variety of ways?
It's a good question, and it was something that I was thinking about while I was reading the work. But the thing that I kept coming back to is that Asano isn't, the work is explicit, and there's definitely no denying that. But I didn't read the work as being titillating, as being designed to arouse its readers. I mean, forget the different kind of sexual mores between Japan and the United States, and the kind of friction between me not really having. I'm not an expert on what is kind of acceptable practice in Japan, if this is totally normal or if they found this shocking. But I mean, forget all of that. I think this is it's a work that Asano isn't. He's simply not shying away from the realities of teenage behavior, and it is explicit, but it's not, it's not something that I think he intended his audience to get off on. We talked, and the thing I kept coming back to specifically when I was reading the work was that, on the last episode that we posted kind of early this month, we talked about school judgment and there being like a 12, 13-year-old character in that who is designed with this incredibly mature body, who's designed to kind of arouse and tease the readers in a way that I was kind of uncomfortable with. But this is a book that's much, much, much more explicit. It's much more graphic, but it definitely isn't designed to have even that effect. That
exactly.
Yeah. That a more kind of sanitized, quote unquote, book has. So I didn't think it was a problem. It definitely is it definitely confronts you with this very explicit reality of how teenagers in the real world behave. But it's not it's not sexy. It's very sexual, but it's not sexy.
And that's a good way to make that distinction. And I'm glad that you are making a connection to what we discussed when we were looking at Schoolhouse Judgment, in that there's something different about taking a young teenage or even younger body and sexualizing it in ways that are, obviously titillating or intended to titillate. That's gratuitous. That is exploitive in many ways. It's different, though, in the kind of sexualization that's going on here in A Girl on the Shore. Mm-hmm. Asano does take our protagonist and makes her a sexual being, but she and her friends that we see throughout this narrative, the female friends, are presented as young girls. And so their breast size, the shape of their hips, are like young girls. And there's really nothing about them that is eroticized. The only thing that's sexual about this book is the sexual act that Kome and Isobe engage in. And then Kome with another character we haven't mentioned yet, Isaki, who is a completely despicable character, who seems to get some of the stuff that he deserves. He's one of these pretty boys who knows that women love him, and he takes advantage of that. And when this story opens, we see him taking advantage of Kome. But the reason I ask you that question, did you see any issues or problems in showing, 15-year-olds having sex in the ways that they do? I wasn't coming from a more puritanical perspective or a Bible Belt perspective, saying, this is problematic. To me, it seems that, and this is going to sound strange because we're talking about, there's anal, there's oral, there's quite a bit going on in here, right? But there's an innocence to it. And part of the innocence, maybe the fact that we have two young kids here who are exploring one another's body in many ways for another sex's body for the first time. But the way that Asano presents it seems to be with quite a bit of tenderness. And again, it's not gratuitous at all. Now, I guess someone could find this titillating and someone could find this highly erotic, but I think what I came away with is that Asano's intentions were to show something a little more innocent, although that's rather ironic, right? As much as you see going on in this book.
Yeah, I think that is a really good way to put it. It is the way he frames it and the way he kind of draws it, and even his kind of panel to panel syntax it's different from, I think, the way a lot of cartoonists or even filmmakers would kind of render those scenes. It lacks the ubiquitous male gaze, as it were. It's not he's not composing his images to maximize the kind of eroticism of them. It's very he emphasizes the kind of emotional expression that the character's body language kind of represents. I guess he's more interested in the kind of way Kome is holding her hands, or the way her head is kind of down, or things like that, than in eroticizing her body. It's very much a work that is very tender. There are very emotional scenes instead of these very visceral scenes.
Exactly. And I think another thing that makes their relationship more innocent than otherwise is the fact that they're juxtaposed to a relationship that I think for all practical purposes is unquestionably innocent, and that is the one that occurs relatively late in the book, or develops late in the book, between Kome's friend Kaiko and a boy by the name of Kashima, who at first has, it seems to me, an apparent crush on Kume, but then Kaiko hooks up with eventually. And so they develop something. I don't know if I would call it a relationship or boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. Mm-hmm. It seems to be going in that direction toward the end, but there's something definitely innocent about that. I mean, because Kaiko and Kashima are definitely more immature, inexperienced than Kume and Isobe. But yet Kome fits right into the world that Keiko and their other friends inhabit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Asano really, and these kind of teenage characters are recurring throughout his work, or at least what I've read of it in Goodnight Punpun and Nejika Holograph. He definitely understands the kind of deceptively complex, or deceptively innocent, I should say, way that teenagers behave. You know, teenagers have a lot going on that they don't are unwilling to say or act on or unable to express in a meaningful or articulable way. And I think Asano really picks up on that, and you can see that in the different relationships that he kind of depicts. You know, it's not just this kind of super unhealthy, emotionally stunted relationship. He demonstrates that he has a good grasp on creating these very rich characters who express themselves in really complicated ways.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we move off of A Girl on the Shore, I want to ask you what you think that title refers to.
That is a great question, and I'm glad you asked, because I was actually going to ask you the same thing. You know, there's a recurring image throughout the book of Kome on the shore, this beach by her house, where she kind of looks for flotsam and jetsam, and even the very first and the very last images of the book are her on the shore or in the water, and I think that, coupled with the cover that Vertical gave to this English edition, it definitely created the idea, the expectation that she would be the kind of titular girl on the shore. But then, you know, in the book, there's obviously a girl who is referred to a girl on the shore that is on an SD card that Isobe finds on the beach that they put in their camera. They accidentally discover this woman had taken a ton of pictures of her at the beach. And so I was a little thrown. I wasn't sure what to think of that. But I began thinking that maybe there's a magical realist element of the book, and that this girl on the shore who Isobe says he meets, but we never actually see outside of these photographs. Maybe she is some future Kome. But there's also another complication with the title, because from what I understand, that the original title, which I'm looking at now and I'm going to try and not mess up, is Umibi no Onanoko, which, from what I understand, I've been told, I could have been lied to, is more literally translates to a girl by the shore. And the difference between a girl on and by, it creates this double meaning with by. She's both a girl, on the shore, but she's also a product of the shore. And so I think the title refers to Kame specifically, but it's unclear really what the significance of the shore is to the story.
Yeah, I think that the way that you framed the title within the context of Kome and her relationship with the shore and the sea, I think is spot on. So I think you could read the title within the context of Kome. That just makes sense to me. But the other thing you had mentioned, this mysterious girl whose images appear on this SD card that Isobe finds is significant as well. And if we're going to look at the title within that context, I see the girl on the shore not so much as the girl in the pictures as the girl on the shore as an idea that ends up coming between Isobe and Kome. because at one point in the story, Isobe is taken by that girl whose images are on that SD card, and with one of those pictures, he makes a computer background, his wallpaper, out of it. And in fact, Kome is a little offended by that and ends up deleting all of those photos that Isobe has saved on his hard drive. And in fact, the young girl who's in those pictures, I mean, she does seem the more sexualized variety of young woman. And of course, we found out later that she's a little older, if we're to believe Isobe, that he actually did meet her. But she is much more developed up top, let's say, than Kome. And so, Isobe, it's almost as if he has those images on his computer's wallpaper in ways like when I was growing up, we had Farrah Fawcett and Linda Carter posters in our bedrooms as young boys. Kome doesn't like this. And so this is something that does come between the two of them. And it's not just a minor argument, because this almost causes a serious rift between the two of them.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of the girl in the shore in the photographs as a kind of metaphor for this interposing conflict that kind of is the first. It's the first kind of instance where we see Kome developing real feelings towards Isobe.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, I definitely have to think about it more, especially in that context, and kind of think through the metaphoric meaning and the way that relates to this particular relationships, but maybe the metaphor for jealousy and conflict in the universal relationship. So yeah, that's a tough question. I think we're trying to answer, but I definitely have to think about it some more. Was there anything else about A Girl on the Shore that you want to touch on before we move to Goodnight Punpun?
Yeah, well, there's always more that we could talk about really good books like this, but let's move on to the next work that we're looking at for this month, and this is also by Inio Asano, Goodnight Punpun, Volume 1, and this was published just this month by Viz Media. And this is, how shall we put it, a very different kind of book from A Girl on the Shore. How do we begin to describe what Goodnight Punpun is all about?
I think plot-wise, it's pretty straightforward. It's a Bildungsroman of a young.
It's pretty straightforward. You would use the word straightforward in describing Goodnight Punpun?
I'm going to qualify it. It's a pretty straightforward about a young boy coming of age, and he's maybe 12, 13. He's growing up and he's going on adventures with his friends. But the only qualification is that he's a bird thing that never speaks.
Okay.
He's like a very abstract cartoon drawing of a bird that only speaks in voiceover narration or through this expository, omniscient narration. But the plot is pretty straight. You got to give me that. The plot is pretty straightforward. What actually happens in the book is relatively simple and ordinary. It's the fact that Punpun is this cartoon bird thing that no one seems to comment on. That's the weird part.
Right, exactly. And it's not just Punpun who is this abstracted, cartoony bird thing, but it's the members of his family as well. So yes. Punpun's last name is Punyama. So he's Punpun Punyama, and then there's Papa Punyama, and then Mama Punyama, and then his uncle, or at least he says he's his uncle, and his name escapes me.
Yuichi.
Yuichi. And so all four of them are drawn as this abstracted, cartoony, bird-type characters. And I think bird is probably the best way of describing this. I don't even know if they're birds, but it's the closest thing that I think we can use to describe what the punyamas are. And the strange thing is that Punpun, and of course his family, are the only individuals represented visually in this manner. Everyone else in this story is drawn in a more realistic manner. Now, at times, it's almost kind of a surrealistic kind of realism with what happens, but that's more the situations than, I think, the character or setting depiction. You're right in that the story of Punpun, his interactions with his friend, and then his feelings for Eiko, who is a young girl who, at the beginning of this volume, just begins as a new student at his school. And, Punpun is really taken by her. His interactions with them and what the various things that they do primarily make up the story. But there are things that happen along the way that turn quite surrealistic. I would even say psychedelic at times. And so it's as if we're getting an Asano that is maybe on something. I don't mean literally on something, but this, to me, going from earlier books like Solanin and, let's say, even A Girl on the Shore to something like Goodnight Punpun is like going from the Beatles' Rubber Soul to Sgt. Pepper's. It gets kind of wild and trippy.
I think, there definitely are wild and trippy kind of scenes or panels, but I think Asano is really reveling in that particularly interesting kind of facet of comics, that uniqueness of comics, and that he can draw this incredibly straightforward story, but every time Punpun, for example, thinks of sex, or he learns about sex, or he learns about what a vagina is, there are these like one or two panel incredibly surrealistic interludes. It's not a surrealistic plot, and it doesn't rely on the story doesn't rely on this surrealistic imagery, but these very, very ordinary and simple feelings are represented by these very surrealistic kind of static images. And so he is able to combine that banality of plot with that fantastic kind of imagery, that then it doesn't distract it. It kind of heightens that. It is a better representation of those very ordinary things than a more straightforward artistic representation, shall we say.
Right. And I think we first see the trippy side of Goodnight Punpun fairly early on. Now, we're both looking from a PDF that Viz Media was so kind to give us to prepare for this month's episode. So I don't see page numbers here, but this is the first time that we see God. And yes, we do see, I guess, God here. And Punpun is mentioning, or he's telling us, and I'll say as an aside, as you pointed out, we never see Punpun directly speak. Whenever there is dialogue or he says something, it's in usually kind of a black panel with just white words, and it's almost as if we hear him from a distance, but we never see him with word balloons. So anyway, he is saying at one point, gods always came, his uncle tells him, when he chanted, dear God, tinkle hoy. And whenever Punpun says, dear God, tinkle hoy, God pops up. And how would you describe God? God, and this seems to me the face, and it's it's the same image that Asano uses over and over again. It's almost as if he's taken a photograph of what I call a young Japanese hipster. With wild hair and with a big grin on his face, and that's the head of God. and he pops up in kind of strange situations and scenarios at times whenever Punpun calls him, dear God, tinkle hoy.
Mm-hmm. See, I actually really love this weird representation of God, because it is totally like what God, would be like, kind of converging on like a real person. It would be like this. It would be like a being. It's like a being from outside of reality converging on reality, and I like the way that Inio Asano kind of contrasts the aesthetic of Punpun or Punpun's world with this character, as if this figure from a wholly different reality is intruding on this diegesis. I think it's totally super weird, but it totally works. It's totally like, what if this extra universal being was in our reality? He wouldn't look like some guy, he wouldn't look like a normal person, right? He would look like a being from outside of reality. And I think Asano does a good job of both having fun with that idea and of representing that omnipotence of God, if it's God, because we're never sure if it's actually God or if it's just in Punpun's head.
Exactly. And, I'm with you on this. I really do love the way that Asano draws this figure as God. In fact, when I was reading this first volume of Goodnight Punpun, I was looking forward to those moments. Those were the most enjoyable parts of this book, is whenever God showed up, because sometimes his face would be put on other things in other contexts. But it's the same image that Asano uses again and again to represent God. And it's funny. You can tell that Asano was really having a good time doing this. But there are other moments beside the God moments that are kind of strange and whacked out. One that stands out to me is, I guess this is about halfway through the book, and this part of the story takes up a good part of this first volume, is when Punpun and his friends, several other young boys, who don't look like strange abstracted bird figures, they're part of the PWC, the Porn Watchers Club. And they're walking down the street, and they come across this video cassette of porn. And so they're surprised, and they rush back to one of their houses, and they put the video cassette in, and they start watching, what begins as a porn film. But then all of a sudden there's some static, and there's a man that appears on their screen and says something to the effect of, I wanted you to get the message. I planted this there for you so I could tell you what I wanted to tell you, and then you can go out and tell the authorities. And there's this young guy who's telling them about having killed members of his family and where he put the family, but there's also quite a bit of money where he hid the bodies. And for the kids to go find the bodies, they can get the money, and then they could tell the authorities. But by the time that they tell the authorities, he would have already killed himself because of what he did. He didn't want to live anymore. And so this was a message that was inserted on that porn video that these kids found. And I mean, but what's so wild about that, outside of the whole scenario, is that this guy who's on the video cassette, at the end of his message, he gets up and starts doing this weird dance. And starts prancing around this room that he's recording this video in. And then the kids get up and start doing that dance as well. And I'm going, oh my God. I mean, this is trippy territory. And then every now and again, you'll see the kids or other characters doing a bit of that dance in the story after that. After that moment. And that's just one of the many surrealistic moments in Goodnight Punpun, where things, it's almost as if we have a momentary diversion from the main, more realistic storyline into something much more psychedelic.
Yeah, that's definitely like a hallmark of Asano's of work. It is. I was talking with a number of friends earlier today about magical realism and kind of what comics would be considered magical realism, and I kind of had that in the back of my head while I was reading, not just Punpun, but A Girl on the Shore as well. And I think that's a pretty good descriptor for Asano's work. It does have these fanciful or fantastic or supernatural or apocalyptic or surrealistic elements, depending on the work. But running throughout is this hyper realistic aesthetic, and this very, very humanistic interest in explicating these very real and very hard to get at emotions.
Mm-hmm. This is interesting. You've used magical realism a few times on this episode in talking about Asano's work. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, that is not style that I would think about initially before you mention this when it comes to Asano's work. Fantastical, yes. Fabulistic, yes. Even according to older definitions of romance writing, certainly. Not magic realism. To me, magic realism, the defining feature of magic realism is that there is that magical part of it, right? The first part of that phrase. But what makes it more realistic is that within a narrative, something fantastical and magical happens, but no one thinks of it as fantastic or magical. I mean, they just take it for granted. It's like, oh, people float? Okay, well, people normally float. There's nothing wrong with that. Or, you have someone with a slit throat whose throat heals up and kind of, I'm talking about Beloved here, and this becomes kind of a normal person. Okay, those things happen. So again, the magical becomes the ordinary, where people don't think much of this. But that's different than what we see going on here in Goodnight Punpun, is that these strange psychedelic events occur, or people behave in weird ways. But I wonder if this is what's going on in one or more characters' minds, or if this is just a kind of a hyperbolic way that Asano is representing behavior and imagination.
I think that's a fair point, but I think we're to understand Punpun as literally being this this bird thing, and that kind of fits that definition of magical realism for me, at least. This
ornithological realism.
But I think that's you raise a fair point that his characters do raise concerns about certain things that happen. But his work is kind of difficult to kind of categorize. It's very slippery like that.
Yes. Another thing I really like about this book is something I mentioned earlier, the almost over-exaggeration that certain characters, usually adults, will engage in. Like there's one at one point, Punpun's uncle brings home a lawyer who's going to be working with him, and his uncle's sister, which is Punpun's mother, to divorce the father, because early in the story, the father apparently hits the mother and sends her to the hospital. But the lawyer is shown, he's drawn more realistically, but in almost kind of a grotesque manner when he smiles, and he says, like, yip, yip, all the time. It's almost as if he has some kind of Tourette's syndrome thing going on here. But it's not that in the narrative. But you have other adult characters who every now and again will be over-exaggerated, and in their facial expressions, again, rather grotesque in the way that they're drawn. And in fact, toward the beginning, we see at Punpun's school a teacher and the school's principal playing a game, I think it's of hide and seek, isn't it? And the principal or the teacher keeps screaming, "Yeah! Yeah! Ee!" And they keep doing this. It's like, oh my God, what the hell? When I first read this, I thought, what is going on here? I mean, this is strange. but it's strange in a fun way. It's not strange in a way that you're wondering, is this narrative going to break down and you won't get what's going on? I mean, one of the things that strikes me as a big difference between Goodnight Punpun, Volume 1, and A Girl on the Shore is that with Goodnight Punpun, Asano is having a very good time writing this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked briefly about it before we started recording, but there's definitely a lighter, goofier tone. I think
Goofy,
Asano
that's a good word. I like that.
I think Asano does a good job of handling these. There are certain points where he does address these alienating and existential issues, and he does a good job of explicating the way that Punpun feels, which is, I think, is going to be very familiar to pretty much anyone who's been a teenager or been alive for any length of time. These pressing issues and feelings that frighten you or confuse you or give you anxiety. He does a really, really good job of representing those and exploring those and playing those out. But there is this overarching goofy tone to it that is very distinct from the tone in Nijigahara Holograph or A Girl on the Shore. But I think you're right. I think he was having a lot of fun when he was writing this. There are some very, very strange, very fun elements, particularly in that first part.
Right. Now, you mentioned the existential part of this, and it's funny, the first time you read this, or I guess when you flip through Goodnight Punpun, existential may not be the first word that would immediately come to mind. But you're right. I mean, there is a very heavy, serious side of Goodnight Punpun that you can see in some of his earlier work, such as A Girl on the Shore or Ninjigahara Holograph. And I think this book gets deepest about two-thirds of the way in. We mentioned earlier that one of the main storylines here in Goodnight Punpun is when Punpun and his friends go on this almost like, Stand By Me kind of journey, right? Looking for the dead bodies. And they're hoping to get some money out of this. And they go to this old abandoned warehouse and various things happen. And at this point, and I think it's right before chapter, 16, something happens. We won't give it away. And Punpun, the way it's described, Punpun had reached his limit, is what Asano writes. And then beginning with chapter 16, because I'm looking at it right now, Asano writes, Punpun was very slowly sifting through the various events that made up his short life and reliving them. And at this point, we see Punpun, who's in bed with a nightcap on, but his bed is attached to 4 different propeller planes, and they're flying him on his bed above this strange, almost alien-looking landscape. And he's having what could be called almost a psychedelic experience. I mean, he's just gone through some kind of traumatic event, and so this probably is stuff that's going on in his head. So we have a lot of references to scenes that had occurred earlier in the narrative, and things get a little religious and philosophical at times. And again, it's almost as if he is having some kind of dream-like religious experience where he is attempting to put parts of his life together here. And I think this strikes me as one of the most existential parts of this story.
Yeah, it's definitely where he's kind of confronting his own mortality. But even, I mean, there are questions not even relating to Punpun per se, but I mean, we briefly mentioned his father hits his mother, but then his mother has this arc, at least in this first volume, where she's questioning whether or not she even wants to be a parent, whether she even likes her child. There's, her arc is full of regret for the way she's lived her life. So
right, there's even a question of her attempting to commit suicide at one point.
Yeah,
at the hospital.
Yeah, it's and then his uncle has this kind of arc where he's dealing with the need to be a responsible kind of custodian, but he doesn't really feel, or he kind of obviously lacks, or there's a conflict, I should say, between what he feels like a good guardian should kind of impart on their charge and what he actually believes about existence and reality and God. So the book is full of these little moments and these little scenes where Punpun and the kind of cast of characters in this book are dealing with some pretty heavy stuff. And there's a particular moment, I'm looking for it now I'm looking at the PDF and I'm looking for it, where something happens and he's unsure what he's feeling, like what that is, what that emotion is, what that sensation is. And he says, for expedience's sake, he'll call it fear. He'll say he was scared.
Oh yeah, I remember that now.
And I remember reading that, and that really struck me as very. It's very true to life when you're a kid and you experience some anxiety and you don't know what's causing it, or you experience an anxiety or fear for the first time and you don't know what it is. You don't know what's causing it. You don't know if other people feel this way or anything, and you're just kind of like fumbling in the dark. And so you just kind of attach this name to it, so you have something to call it by. That little line, that little scene, really, really struck me as this really, really incredible rendering of those childhood, those teenage emotions where you don't know what's going on, you don't know how you're feeling. So yeah, I think Goodnight Punpun is a really really meaty, substantive work wrapped in this really, really goofy package.
It is, and I think that's a great way of putting it. A meaty work in a goofy package.
This is the first work of Asano's that I've read that's really of any real length, and the series is concluded. And I was telling you that a number of my friends have read illicit fan translations online of it, and they really, 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 really like the series. But I've never read anything of Asano's that was longer than 1 or 2 volumes. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you thought he would be able to sustain this momentum, I should say, for I think it was originally 13 volumes in Japan, but I'm trying to do the math in my head, and I think it's going to come out to about 7 volumes in English. Not that they've said officially, I don't think, but about I think it's going to come out to be about 7. Do you think he's going to be able to sustain that for that long stretch?
I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I hope so, because this was a really fun read. I was looking at Amazon, and Volume 2 of Goodnight Punpun is going to be released on June 21st. Mm-hmm. And again, these are pub dates that are listed on Amazon, so they may appear in comic shops before that. So Volume 2 is coming out on June 21st, and then Volume 3 is slotted for September 20th. And then I don't see anything past Volume 3. So you hear that there are going to be maybe 7 English volumes of this?
Well, I looked to see, and there was about 140 something chapters, and I think this first volume covers about 20. So I was just trying to do the math in my head, and it seemed like it would come out to about 7 at 20 each or around there. But obviously, like, that's a total guesstimate, and it's probably going to be wrong. So I don't know.
Yeah. It's definitely a fun read, and I know that a question that we always ask each other on these manga shows, whenever we're dealing with a series that is currently ongoing, mm-hmm. Whether in the original or with English editions, if we're going to continue reading this. And I can tell you, I will definitely go on to read the rest of Goodnight Punpun. Will you?
Yeah, I think I have to say that I'm definitely gonna check out other volumes. I really, really liked. I really like both of the books we talked about today, but Punpun in particular, I'm really, really excited to see how Asano develops the character and his story. So what's that? 4 thumbs up, 2 thumbs up from us on Punpun.
Yeah, and the thing about Inio Asano is almost anything he does, I'm on board for, and it's kind of like Junji Ito. Almost anything he does, I'm going to try because I'm sold on him.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much how I feel about Ito, but Asano as well. I'm really taken with the kind of 3 books of his, I guess, now that I've read, and so yeah, I'll definitely at least give a shot to whatever he's putting out.
So there you go. We discussed for the month of March 2 books from Inio Asano. We began with A Girl on the Shore, which is published by Vertical Press. And then we discussed after that Volume 1 of Goodnight Punpun from Viz Media. So a lot of great stuff there. And you can find some of these books by going to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. In fact, you can pre-order those those next volumes of Goodnight Punpun at great discounts. Discount Comic Book Service, you can't go wrong, whether it be manga or otherwise. You should also check out the website of our other sponsor for this episode, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. Go to justcoffee.coop, and upon checkout, be sure to use the coupon code COMICS. That'll give you 10% off of your order. And after you get your manga and your coffee through those guys, get in touch with us and let us know what kind of manga you're going to be reading and what kind of coffee you decided to order from Just Coffee Co-op. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message directly from the web browser through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's really simple and easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to get in touch with us via email, you can email them both of us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me at Shea@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, how can they email you?
Yes, you can email me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over the social media sphere, such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So a lot of ways that people can get in touch with us.
That's right. I'm sure people who listen to this regularly are tired of me telling you that we need to get a fax.
Well, who knows? Maybe someday. We'll see.
I only have one joke, and that's it.
That's it. A one-trick pony. But we like you as a one-trick pony because that way you become kind of predictable and lovable.
As long as I'm lovable, I'll take the predictable.
Yeah. But seriously, guys, we do like to hear from you, so write to us, and if you have manga suggestions, we'd love to hear them. And until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you later.